They buried her. And then the town started seeing her again. Not because she returned, but because they still needed her. Funerals in Whitcomb were efficient. Not cold. Not emotional. Just organized. People stood where they were supposed to stand. They said the things that were expected of them. They waited for the right moment to sigh. Eleanor Price would have appreciated that. She had organized most of them. The wind from the sea moved slowly across the cemetery, lifting coats and hair, never quite strong enough to be dramatic. Grey clouds hung low, undecided about rain. Edward Hale was not there. This story did not begin with him. It began with a woman who had spent her life making sure other people didn't have to make difficult choices. Such a shame, someone whispered. She always knew what to do, another voice replied. That's what we'll miss, said a third. Having someone to handle things. The phrase passed quietly between people, unnoticed. Handle things. The coffin was lowered. The priest spoke. Heads bowed. Eleanor Price was 47 years old when she died. Heart failure, the report said. Sudden, but not suspicious. Stress was mentioned. It usually was. People nodded at that. Stress was a convenient explanation. It required no follow-up. Afterwards, people gathered in the community hall. Tea. Biscuits. Polite conversation. The kind of environment Eleanor had navigated effortlessly for years. She helped me with the council dispute, one woman said. She sorted it in a week. She talked to my neighbor, said a man. Saved me a lawsuit. She always said she'd take care of it, someone added. No one noticed the pattern forming. They were all saying the same thing. For days later, Thomas Reed missed his bus. He was irritated, not upset. Missing the bus in Whitcomb was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. He stood at the stop near the old pier, hands in his coat pockets, watching the road with mild resentment. That was when he saw her. She stood on the opposite side of the street, near the closed bookshop. Same height. Same posture. Same careful way of holding her bag, as if it contained something fragile. Eleanor Price. Thomas froze. His first thought was not she's alive. It was, I must be tired. She turned her head slightly. Their eyes met. Not dramatically. Not meaningfully. Just long enough for recognition to register. Then she looked away and walked toward the harbor. Thomas didn't follow. He didn't shout. He stood very still until the bus arrived, 10 minutes later than usual. That evening, he told his wife. I thought I saw Eleanor, he said, casually, as if testing the sentence. His wife didn't laugh. Where, she asked. By the pier. She frowned. You must be mistaken. Yes, Thomas said quickly. Of course. But later that night, he lay awake, replaying the moment. Not the face. The look. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hollow. It was tired. The next sighting happened the following afternoon. Margaret Lewis saw Eleanor near the grocery store. She was certain of it. Margaret had known Eleanor for years. They had argued. They had disagreed. They had resolved things, usually because Eleanor insisted. She didn't look at me, Margaret later told the police. That was the strange part. What do you mean? The officer asked. She always looked at people, Margaret said. This time, it was like she didn't want to. By the third report, the police were no longer dismissing it. They weren't calling it a ghost. They weren't calling it hysteria. They were calling it a problem. Inspector Daniel Wright sat at his desk, staring at a map of Whitcomb dotted with small red circles. Sightings. Different locations. Different times. Different witnesses. Same woman. Same description. Same sentence, repeated with unsettling consistency. She looked like she knew I'd seen her. Daniel Wright disliked patterns almost as much as he disliked attention. And this was attracting both. By the end of the week, people were talking. Quietly at first. Then less so. She was always here, someone said. Why would she leave now, said another. At the pub, a man laughed nervously. Maybe she's checking if we finally sorted things out without her. The laughter died quickly. Because no one was entirely sure they had. The fourth sighting was the one that changed everything. A teenage boy saw Eleanor standing outside the municipal building late at night. He took a photo. The image was blurred. Poorly lit. Inconclusive. But the outline was unmistakable. Same coat. Same hair. Same careful distance from everyone else. The photo made its way to social media by morning. By noon, Whitcomb had stopped pretending nothing was happening. That afternoon, Inspector Wright made a call he did not enjoy making. Yes, he said into the phone. We've checked the records. He paused. Yes. Burial confirmed. Another pause. No. I don't believe in ghosts either. He sighed. I need someone who understands how people see things, he said. Not what they see. Why? He waited. Then. Yes, he said. Edward Hale. That evening, Thomas Reed stood at his kitchen window, watching the street. His wife was in the other room, pretending not to worry. A figure moved slowly past the lamppost. Thomas held his breath. The woman didn't look up. But for a moment, just a moment, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not fear. Relief. As if someone else was still watching over the things he hadn't fixed yet. He whispered to the empty room. Thank God she's still here. Outside, the woman turned the corner and disappeared from sight. In Whitcomb, night settled in quietly. The sea kept its distance. The town held its breath. And somewhere on the road toward it, Edward Hale was already driving, unaware that this case would test something he rarely questioned. Whether seeing is ever just seeing. Edward Hale arrived in Whitcomb just after noon. The town looked exactly like it wanted to be perceived: clean, quiet, responsible. The kind of place where problems were supposed to stay small and polite. Edward distrusted places like that. Inspector Daniel Wright met him outside the station. Mid-40s, neat coat, careful posture, a man who preferred order not because he loved it, but because disorder made him nervous. Thank you for coming, Wright said, shaking Edward's hand. I know this isn't standard. Nothing interesting ever is, Edward replied. Wright gestured toward the building. We're not calling it anything, Wright said as they walked. No ghosts. No hysteria. Good, Edward said. Names come later. Damage comes early. Wright didn't like that answer, but he nodded anyway. Inside, the station felt too bright. Edward noticed the way officers spoke quietly, as if volume itself might make the problem real. Wright laid out the reports. 7 sightings, he said. Independent witnesses. No alcohol. No history of delusion. Edward scanned the pages. They all knew her, Edward said. Yes, Wright replied. Or knew of her. Edward looked up. That's worse, he said. They visited Thomas Reed first. Thomas greeted them with excessive politeness, the kind that tried to stay ahead of judgment. I told my wife it must have been someone else, Thomas said. I don't believe in, you know. You don't need to believe, Edward said calmly. Just tell me what you saw. Thomas swallowed. She was standing across the street, he said. Not doing anything. Just waiting. Waiting for what? Edward asked. Thomas hesitated. I don't know, he said. That's what bothered me. Edward nodded. Did you feel afraid? Edward asked. No, Thomas said immediately. Then paused. No. I felt relieved. Edward's pen stopped. Relieved, Edward repeated. Yes, Thomas said, confused by his own answer. Like, things weren't completely unfinished. Edward looked at Wright briefly. Then back to Thomas. What would have been unfinished? Edward asked. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. I suppose, he said slowly, a few things Eleanor was helping me with. Edward nodded again. Thank you, he said. That's enough. Margaret Lewis was less cooperative. I know what I saw, she snapped. And I don't need anyone telling me my eyes lied. Edward listened patiently. I'm not here to argue with your eyes, he said. I'm here to understand your mind. Margaret bristled. She avoided me, Margaret said. That's what convinced me. Why? Edward asked. Margaret frowned. Because Eleanor always faced things head-on, she said. If it was really her, she wouldn't have avoided me. Edward tilted his head. So the thing that convinced you it was her, he said, was also the thing that convinced you it wasn't. Margaret stared at him. That doesn't make sense, she said. Edward smiled faintly. It makes perfect sense, he said. Just not logically. By late afternoon, Edward had a notebook full of the same pattern. Not locations. Not times. Emotions. Relief. Guilt. Avoidance. Expectation. He and Wright walked along the seafront as the light began to fade. This town misses her, Wright said. Edward shook his head. No, he said. This town misses what she did for them. Wright frowned. That's the same thing. Edward stopped walking. No, he said gently. It really isn't. They reviewed the photo at the station. Blurry. Inconclusive. Familiar enough to invite belief. This could be anyone, Wright said. Yes, Edward agreed. Which is why it's perfect. For what? Wright asked. Edward looked at the image. For projection, he said. That evening, Edward asked to see Eleanor Price's office. It hadn't been cleared out yet. Her desk was neat. Too neat. Files stacked carefully. Notes labeled in calm handwriting. Edward picked one up. I'll handle this. Leave it with me. I'll speak to them. Edward closed his eyes briefly. Wright watched him. She was very capable, Wright said. She was very overused, Edward replied. They sat in silence for a moment. You don't think she's alive, Wright said. No, Edward replied. And you don't either. Wright sighed. So what is this? Edward looked around the empty office. This, he said, is what happens when responsibility dies, but expectations don't. Wright frowned. You're saying people are imagining her? Edward shook his head. No, he said. They're outsourcing themselves to her memory. As Edward left the building, he noticed a woman across the street. Medium height. Dark coat. Hair pulled back. For half a second, just half, his mind offered the simplest explanation. There she is. Edward stopped. The woman turned slightly. It wasn't Eleanor. Edward exhaled slowly. Wright noticed. You thought, Wright began. Yes, Edward said quietly. I did. Wright looked unsettled. That happens to you too. Edward nodded. That's how I know this case matters, he said. Later, alone in his hotel room, Edward reviewed his notes. One sentence circled twice. She's still here. Not she's alive. Not she returned. She's still here. Edward leaned back, staring at the ceiling. People didn't want Eleanor back. They wanted to delay the moment they had to speak for themselves. Edward whispered into the quiet room. Someone is keeping her alive. Not in body. In function. Outside, Whitcomb settled into evening. Lights turned on one by one. Windows glowed. And somewhere near the harbor, a woman walked quietly through the town, unaware that she had become a solution people were afraid to lose. Edward Hale did not believe in ghosts. But he believed very much in usefulness. By the second morning in Whitcomb, it had become clear that Eleanor Price was still extremely useful. Inspector Wright joined Edward in the small conference room at the station, carrying a stack of fresh complaints. "They're not reports," Wright said, dropping them on the table. "They're requests." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Requests for what?" he asked. Wright exhaled. "People asking what Eleanor would have done," he said. "About parking disputes. Property lines. Noise complaints." Edward looked at him. "She's been dead for 10 days, Edward said. "I know," Wright replied. "But they keep saying it like she's just unavailable." Edward nodded slowly. "That's because unavailable is temporary," he said. "Dead is final. And final is inconvenient." Edward asked to see the municipal offices again. This time, they weren't quiet. Phones rang. People argued in harsh tones. Decision stalled mid-sentence. A man in a suit stood near the reception desk, speaking sharply into a phone. "No, we can't move forward without guidance," the man said. "Yes, I know Eleanor would have handled this." Edward stopped. The man noticed him watching and stiffened. "Can I help you?" or the man asked, defensive. Edward smiled politely. "I'm sure you can," he said. "You must be Michael Reeves." The man hesitated. "Yes," he said. "And you are?" "Edward Hale," Edward replied. "I study what happens when systems lose a person they rely on too much." Reeves' jaw tightened. "We're managing," he said. Edward glanced around. "Are you?" he asked. Reeves' office was larger than Eleanor's had been. Less personal. More strategic. Reeves spoke quickly, efficiently, with the practiced confidence of someone used to delegating. "Eleanor was very dedicated," Reeves said. "Sometimes too dedicated." Edward nodded. "Who replaced her?" Edward asked. Reeves hesitated. "No one," he said. "Not yet." Edward looked up. "And in the meantime?" he asked. Reeves spread his hands. "We do our best," he said. Edward leaned back. "And when people ask what to do," Edward said, "what do you tell them?" Reeves frowned. "I tell them what Eleanor would have done," he said. Edward smiled faintly. "Of course you do," he said. That afternoon, Edward met the woman. Not Eleanor. The other one. She was cleaning rooms at a small hotel near the harbor. Late 30s. Quiet. Unremarkable in the way that allowed her to pass unnoticed. Her name was Anna Clark. Edward approached her carefully, without surprise. "You look like someone people mistake for someone else," Edward said. Anna stiffened. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Edward nodded. "That's usually true," he replied. She kept her eyes down. "They stare," she said after a moment. "I don't like it." Edward waited. "They think I'm someone I'm not," Anna continued quietly. Edward's voice was calm. "Do they say her name?" he asked. Anna hesitated. "Yes." Edward nodded. "And you don't correct them?" Anna shook her head. "I don't know how," she said. "They look relieved when they see me." Edward felt a familiar chill. Relief again. Anna explained that it had started after the funeral. People slowed down when they saw her. Watched her walk past. Sometimes followed at a distance. One woman had cried. A man had said, "Thank God you're still here." Anna had gone home and locked the door. "I don't want trouble," Anna said. "I just want to work." Edward believed her. That made it worse. You haven't spoken to anyone pretending to be her, Edward said. Anna shook her head quickly. No, she said. I don't even speak much English when I'm nervous. Edward nodded. That's good, he said. Very good. Anna frowned. How is that good? She asked. Edward answered honestly. Because it means you're not the problem, he said. Outside, Wright looked unsettled. So she's not a fraud, Wright said. Not a con artist. No, Edward replied. She's a mirror. A mirror to what? Wright asked. Edward didn't answer immediately. To avoidance, he said. That evening, Edward reviewed Eleanor's emails. Hundreds of them. Requests. Questions. Decisions deferred. Can you handle this? What do you think is best? I trust your judgment. Edward leaned back. She was never meant to carry all this, he murmured. Wright watched him. You think she knew that? Wright asked. Edward nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And she did it anyway. The city council held an emergency meeting. Edward sat at the back, unnoticed. Voices overlapped. Frustration surfaced. We need a temporary solution, someone said. People expect answers, said another. We can't leave things unresolved, Reeves insisted. Edward finally spoke. You already have a temporary solution, Edward said calmly. The room stilled. Reeves turned. And what would that be? He asked. Edward met his gaze. A ghost, Edward said. A very useful one. Murmurs rippled through the room. That's absurd, Reeves snapped. Edward's voice stayed level. You keep invoking her name, he said. You keep saying what she would have done. You keep her operational. Reeves flushed. That's respect, he said. Edward shook his head. No, he said. That's dependency. After the meeting, Reeves confronted Edward privately. You're destabilizing this town, Reeves said sharply. Edward looked at him. No, he said. I'm pointing out what's holding it together. Reeves' voice dropped. You don't understand, he said. If people stop believing she's still here, things fall apart. Edward studied him. Then they should, he said quietly. Reeves stared at him. That's easy for you to say, Reeves said. You don't live here. Edward met his gaze. And that, Edward said, is exactly why I can see it. That night, another sighting was reported. This time, near Eleanor's old office. Someone claimed the woman stood outside the building, looking up at the windows. Edward closed his notebook. They're moving her closer to her function, he said. Wright frowned. What does that mean? He asked. Edward stood. It means the town is rehearsing her return, he said. Not in body. In authority. Wright felt a chill. You think someone's encouraging this? Edward nodded. Not directly, he said. Indirectly is safer. Edward walked alone toward the harbor. He saw Anna in the distance, walking quickly, head down. A man approached her, speaking softly. Edward couldn't hear the words. But he saw the gesture, the man stepping aside, as if making room for her to pass. As if deferring. Edward felt a familiar unease. Not because people believed in ghosts, but because they were practicing obedience. Edward stopped, watching the exchange end harmlessly. Anna hurried away. The man remained behind, thoughtful, as if relieved. Edward whispered to himself. This isn't grief. He turned back toward the station. This is rehearsal. Edward Hale understood the danger the moment the town tried to use the ghost. Not fear it. Not question it. Use it. That was when Whitcomb crossed from confusion into complicity. The morning began with an announcement. Not official. Not written. just a sentence repeated often enough to become real. Michael Reeves will make a statement later today. Edward heard it twice before noon. Both times, it was followed by another sentence. He'll explain what Eleanor would have wanted. Edward closed his notebook. There it is, he said quietly. Inspector Wright frowned. There what is? Edward looked at him. They're preparing to install her, he said. Without the inconvenience of her presence. The municipal hall filled quickly. Not with panic. With expectation. People sat forward in their chairs, notebooks open, ready to receive direction. Edward stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the crowd. He noticed something unsettling. No one asked why Eleanor was being mentioned. They asked how soon things would return to normal. Michael Reeves stepped to the podium, composed, professional, calm. My friends, Reeves began. This town has been through a difficult period. Edward noted the phrasing. Difficult. Not strange. Not unexplained. Reeves continued. Eleanor Price dedicated her life to this community, Reeves said. Her values, her judgment, her methods. Edward whispered, almost to himself. Are still operational. Reeves glanced down at his notes. In the coming weeks, Reeves said, we will be implementing interim guidelines based on Eleanor's established practices. A murmur of relief passed through the room. Edward felt it like pressure. Relief was the signal. Edward stepped forward. Inspector Wright stiffened. Edward, he whispered. This isn't. It is, Edward said calmly. Exactly what it looks like. Edward raised his voice just enough to be heard. Mr. Reeves, Edward said. May I ask a question? Reeves hesitated, then nodded. Of course, he said. We value transparency. Edward smiled faintly. That's good, he said. Because I'm confused. Reeves' smile tightened. About what? He asked. Edward's voice was level. When did Eleanor Price consent to continuing her work after her death? The room stilled. Reeves blinked. That's not, he began. Edward didn't stop. You speak of her values, Edward said. Her judgment. Her methods. But not her consent. Reeves' tone hardened. We're honoring her legacy, he said. Edward nodded. By keeping her useful, he replied. A ripple moved through the audience. Uncomfortable, but not angry. Not yet. Reeves leaned forward. This town needs stability, Reeves said. People are anxious. Edward met his gaze. And ghosts are cheaper than responsibility, he said. Wright stepped in. Edward. Edward raised a hand slightly. Let him answer, Edward said. Reeves exhaled sharply. You're turning this into philosophy, Reeves snapped. People need decisions. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. That's the problem. Edward turned to the room. May I ask you something, he said calmly. No one objected. When Eleanor was alive, Edward said, how many of you disagreed with her? A pause. A few hands rose hesitantly. Edward nodded. And how many of you feel comfortable disagreeing with her now? No hands. Edward let the silence stretch. That, he said quietly, is not respect. Reeves' face flushed. You're implying manipulation, Reeves said. Edward looked at him. No, he said. I'm describing it. Outside the hall, Anna Clark stood frozen. She hadn't meant to be there. She'd been drawn by the crowd, the voices, the sound of Eleanor's name spoken like a command. Edward spotted her through the glass. The resemblance was undeniable in that light. People noticed too. A murmur rippled. Someone whispered. She's here. Edward felt his stomach tighten. This was the dangerous moment. Not fear. Confirmation. Reeves followed the direction of the crowd's gaze. He saw Anna. For a fraction of a second, relief crossed his face. Then calculation. Edward saw it. Reeves raised his voice. "You see?" Reeves said, gesturing toward the window. "Even now, her presence reminds us of who we are." Edward stepped forward sharply. "No," he said. "That woman has nothing to do with Eleanor Price." The room buzzed. Edward continued, louder now. "She is not a symbol," he said. "She is a person you've been projecting onto." Anna backed away, frightened. Edward turned toward her. "Anna," he said gently. "You don't owe anyone anything." The room froze. Reeves snapped. "You're making this worse," he said. "People need reassurance." Edward's voice was firm. "Then give it honestly," he said. "Not by outsourcing it to a dead woman." Edward addressed the crowd again. "You're seeing Eleanor," he said, "because she used to make things easier. She used to decide. She used to absorb conflict." He paused. "She's gone," he said. "And what you're seeing now is the cost of avoiding that fact." Silence. Then a woman spoke. "So what do we do?" she asked. Edward answered immediately. "You decide," he said. "Badly, sometimes. Slowly. Out loud." Reeves shook his head. "This is irresponsible," he said. Edward looked at him. "No," he said. "This is adulthood." Reeves' voice dropped, urgent now. "You don't understand what happens if we let this go," Reeves said. "Things fall apart." Edward nodded. "Yes," he said. "Temporarily." Reeves' jaw clenched. "And if they don't come back together?" Edward met his gaze. "Then they were never together," he said. The meeting dissolved after that. Not dramatically. People left quietly, unsettled. No applause. No outrage. Just a slow dispersal of expectation. Anna left through a side door, unnoticed now. Edward watched her go. He knew what would happen next. The sightings stopped. Not immediately, but decisively. Without the reinforcement, the pattern collapsed. People still thought they saw her sometimes. But they corrected themselves. Out loud. "That's not her," someone would say. And the spell would break. Michael Reeves resigned 2 weeks later. Officially, for personal reasons. Unofficially, because his authority had depended on a borrowed presence. Edward met Inspector Wright on the seafront the day after the announcement. "It's over," Wright said. Edward looked at the sea. "Is it?" he asked. Wright frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward answered quietly. "People learn something," he said. "I just don't know yet if it will last." That evening, Edward walked alone through Whitcomb. He passed the bus stop where the first sighting had occurred. A woman stood there, waiting. Edward slowed. For a brief moment, his mind offered the familiar shortcut. Then he shook it off. The woman looked up. Not Eleanor. Just someone waiting for a bus. Edward nodded to himself and kept walking. Back in his hotel room, Edward wrote one last note in his notebook. A ghost only exists while it solves a problem. He closed the book. Outside, Whitcomb settled into an uncertain night. An uncertainty, Edward thought, was a far healthier thing to live with. Whitcomb did not collapse. That surprised many people. It surprised Michael Reeves most of all. But by the time he realized it, he was already packing his office into cardboard boxes, labeling them carefully, as if order might forgive him for relying on someone else's. No one stopped him when he left. That was the first real sign the town had changed. Decisions became slower. Arguments lasted longer. Meetings ended without conclusions more often than anyone liked. But something else happened too. people started using first-person sentences again. I think. I don't agree. I'm not sure. Edward noticed it in small places. At the cafe, a man argued with the owner about a bill and resolved it himself. At the post office, a woman asked for help, then chose without asking what was best. No one mentioned Eleanor Price. Not because she was forgotten, but because invoking her no longer solved anything. Anna Clark finished her shift early one afternoon and walked along the harbor without feeling watched. That was new. For weeks, she had felt like a reflection someone else kept checking. Now she was just a woman walking home. Edward happened to see her from across the street. She noticed him too. They nodded to each other. Nothing more. That felt right. Later, Anna told the hotel manager she would be moving away. Why? He asked. She considered the question. Because I want to be seen, she said, for who I am. He nodded, not fully understanding, but understanding enough. Inspector Daniel Wright filed his final report carefully. Not because it would be read closely, but because he needed the words to be exact. No evidence of fraud. No evidence of impersonation. Collective misidentification driven by dependency and unresolved responsibility. He read the last sentence twice. Then deleted the word collective. He replaced it with gradual. That felt more honest. Edward Hale stayed one extra night. He did not like leaving towns before they had time to forget him. In the evening, he walked along the seafront, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the waves argue quietly with the shore. He thought about Eleanor Price. Not as a ghost. Not as a symbol. As a person who had been too useful to say no. Edward recognized that instinct. It unsettled him. He stopped near the bus stop where it had all begun. A woman stood there, checking her phone. She looked up. For a split second, Edward's mind offered the shortcut again. There she is. He corrected himself immediately. No. Just someone waiting. The woman smiled politely, then returned to her phone. Edward exhaled. He wasn't immune. He was just practiced. Later that night, Edward packed his bag. As he zipped it shut, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it for a moment. Then answered. Yes, he said. A woman's voice, uncertain. I'm sorry, she said. I was told to call you. Told by whom? Edward asked. There was a pause. I don't know, the woman said. Someone said you help when people see things they're not sure are real. Edward sat down slowly. And what do you see? He asked. The woman hesitated. I see my mother, she said. And she's been dead for 6 years. Edward closed his eyes briefly. When? He asked. Whenever I'm about to make a decision, she said quietly. Edward listened. Then spoke. Tell me, he said, what does she usually say? Another pause. She doesn't, the woman replied. She just waits. Edward nodded, even though she couldn't see him. That's not a ghost, he said gently. That's a question. Silence. Then a soft exhale. Oh, the woman said. Edward smiled faintly. Yes, he said. Exactly. The next morning, Edward left Whitcomb early. The town was waking slowly, imperfectly. As it should. Edward drove without the radio on. Without checking the time. Somewhere behind him, a woman who had once been indispensable remained at rest. And somewhere ahead, another person would soon ask him to explain why seeing isn't always believing. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more psychological mysteries where nothing supernatural is happening, and that's what makes it disturbing. New detective stories are released regularly. Until next time, pay attention to the words people choose.